My parents ignored my accident. Then Grandpa delivered justice. The sound I remember most isn't the crash. It's the silence that came after it on the phone, when my mother didn't say anything for 11 seconds. I counted them later, staring at the call log on my hospital tray, because 11 seconds is a strange thing to hold on to when your leg is in a metal frame and your collarbone is wired together, and you're 26 years old lying in a bed wondering why the two people who raised you sound more inconvenienced than afraid. I want to tell you this story slowly, the way it actually happened to me, because if I rush it, you won't understand how something so quiet could hurt so much. There was no scream. Nobody threw a plate. My family has never been the kind of family that yells. We are the kind of family that smiles at dinner and lets the real damage happen in the space between words. That's the part nobody warns you about. The wound that doesn't bleed is still a wound. My name is Claire. I was driving home from a late shift at the clinic where I worked as a physical therapist, on a road I'd driven 1,000 times, when a delivery truck ran a red light and hit my car broadside. I don't remember the impact. I remember waking up with a paramedic's face very close to mine asking me my name, and I remember thinking absurdly that I needed to call my mother, because some old instinct in me still believed that was the right thing to do when something terrible happens. You call your mother. She comes. She didn't come. Not that night. Not the next day either. I called from the hospital myself, because my phone had survived in my jacket pocket even though I hadn't. A nurse held it up to my ear since my right arm was immobilized, and I heard it ring 3 times before my mother picked up. Claire? Is everything all right? We're in the middle of dinner with the Hendersons. I told her. Car accident. Broken leg, cracked collarbone, possible concussion, surgery scheduled for the morning. I told her I was scared, which was not something I said easily, because in my family fear was treated like bad manners, something you were supposed to keep off your face the way you kept your elbows off the table. There was the silence. 11 seconds. I know because I looked at the screen afterward, the call duration frozen at 4:47, and I did the math backward from where I remembered the pause beginning. Then she said, "Oh honey, that's terrible. Listen, we really can't leave right now. The Hendersons drove 2 hours to see us, but we'll come by this weekend. Are you at Providence?" Not "we're on our way." Not "which hospital." I'm getting in the car. "We'll come by this weekend." As if I had mentioned a mild cold. As if I hadn't just said the word surgery. I want to be fair to myself here, because for years afterward I was not fair to myself. I told myself I was being dramatic, that my mother simply processed things differently, that maybe she panicked in her own way and dinner with the Hendersons was a shield against a fear too big to look at directly. I gave her every possible excuse. That's what you do when the person who is supposed to love you unconditionally fails to show up. You become their defense attorney before you become your own. My father got on the phone for maybe 90 seconds. He asked if I needed money for the copay, which felt like being handed a form to fill out instead of a hand to hold. I said I was covered through my insurance. He said good, and then, "Your mother's right, we'll swing by this weekend, you get some rest." Swing by. Like I lived 2 streets over instead of lying in a hospital bed with a titanium rod about to be screwed into my femur. They did not swing by that weekend either. My younger brother Marcus came on day 3, stayed for 11 minutes, took a selfie with me for his Instagram story with the caption, "Sending love to my brave sister," and left because he had a gym session booked. Marcus was 29, unemployed for most of the past 4 years, living in the guest house behind our parents' property that they called his apartment. And somehow, in the account of our family that everyone agreed to keep telling itself, Marcus was the one going through a hard time. Marcus needed support. Marcus needed patience. I needed a titanium rod and 11 minutes of my brother's schedule. The person who actually came, who sat in the vinyl chair beside my bed for 6 straight hours that first weekend and every weekend after, was my grandfather, my mother's father, a 78-year-old retired contractor named Walter who still drove himself everywhere in a pickup truck that was older than I was. Grandpa Walter didn't say much. He brought me a crossword book because he said hospitals were boring and boredom was worse than pain if you let it sit too long. He held my hand during the parts of physical therapy that made me cry, which was almost all of them at first, and he never once asked me to be brave about it. He just let me be exactly as scared and as furious as I actually was. It was Grandpa Walter who noticed something was wrong before I let myself notice it. "Your mother called today?" he asked on the 5th day, not looking up from the crossword he was working on with a stub of pencil he kept behind his ear. She texted, I said. She's busy with the gala committee thing. He didn't respond to that for a long moment. Then he said, your grandmother used to say that people show you what they value by what they interrupt for. Nothing interrupts your mother for you. That tells you something if you're willing to hear it. I wasn't willing to hear it. Not yet. I had spent 26 years building a version of my family that made sense, one where my parents loved me in a language I just hadn't fully learned to read. And I wasn't ready to burn that story down over one bad week, even a week where I'd had a rod put in my leg and nobody but an old man in a flannel shirt had bothered to sit with me through it. The accident put me out of work for 4 months. Physical therapists, it turns out, make bad patients and worse budgets when they can't work. My savings, which I had been building carefully for years toward a down payment on a small house, started draining fast. Medical bills arrived that even good insurance didn't fully cover. I asked my parents once carefully if they could help me bridge a couple of months until I was back on my feet, literally. My mother said, we'd love to, sweetheart, but things are tight right now, you know how it is. Things had never once in my adult life been tight for my parents. My father ran a successful commercial real estate firm. They had taken 2 vacations that year already, Portugal in the spring and a golf trip to Scotland that my father posted about extensively. Things were not tight. Things were simply not for me. I didn't push. That's the thing about families like mine. You learn early which doors are locked and you stop knocking on them, and you tell yourself that's maturity instead of what it actually is, which is grief you've decided to carry quietly so nobody has to watch you carry it. Grandpa Walter, without me asking, started leaving envelopes. Cash, always in exact amounts that matched something specific, $300 the week my electric bill was due. A folded check the week my physical therapy copay tripled because my program extended. He never made it feel like charity. He'd say things like, I sold some old tools I wasn't using, which I later learned from my grandmother's old friend Dottie, was a lie he told so I wouldn't feel indebted. He wasn't selling tools. He was quietly keeping me afloat while my own parents watched from the shore with their arms folded. It was during one of those visits in month 3 that I first saw the folder. Grandpa Walter had brought a small accordion file with him, the kind with a rubber band around it, tan and worn soft at the corners, and he'd set it on the little rolling table beside my hospital bed while he helped me with my leg exercises. I asked what it was, mostly to make conversation while I gritted through the pain of a resistance band stretch. Old paperwork, he said. Things I've been meaning to sort out for a while. Your grandmother's affairs, mostly, and some of my own. I didn't think much of it then. I was 26 and in physical agony and thinking mostly about whether I'd ever walk without a limp again. I had no idea that folder held the beginning of a story that would take my family apart at the seams 18 months later, not with an explosion, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of paper. By the time I was cleared to walk with a cane, 3 months after the accident, I had noticed a pattern I couldn't stop noticing once I'd started. Every time I needed something, my parents were busy. Every time Marcus needed something, my parents dropped everything. When Marcus's car got repossessed for missed payments, my father drove out personally, paid it off in cash, and set Marcus up with a loan that everyone in the family understood, without ever saying so out loud, would never actually be repaid. When Marcus needed first and last month's rent for an apartment, he lasted 4 months in before moving back to the guest house. My mother wrote the check without blinking. When I asked for help after a car accident that wasn't my fault, I got a text that said, sending healing thoughts your way, 2 hearts. And an offer eventually 3 weeks later, to loan me $200, which they wanted back within the month. I started keeping a mental list. I'm not proud of that, keeping score in your own head about your parents' love. But grief does strange bookkeeping, and mine wanted receipts. I got them sooner than I expected, and not because I went looking. My mother had a habit, going back to when Marcus and I were kids, of using the same email account for nearly everything, a personal Gmail she'd had since 2003, the kind of account that becomes an accidental archive of a person's whole life because they've never once cleaned it out. During a visit home in month 5, back on my feet but still walking carefully, I was using her laptop to print a physical therapy referral form because my printer at my apartment was broken, and her email was already open in a browser tab the way it always was because my mother had never learned to log out of anything in her life. I wasn't snooping. I want to be honest about that because what happened next changed everything, and I need you to understand it wasn't planned. I was looking for the printer settings menu and I clicked the wrong tab and there, sitting in her inbox, was an email chain with the subject line Marcus, Trust Distribution Q3, from an address I recognized as belonging to Feldman and Cross, the estate planning firm my grandparents had used for decades. I shouldn't have opened it. I opened it anyway. The email was from an attorney named Sandra Cross, addressed to my mother, confirming that per your father's original 2015 trust structure, and the subsequent amendments you and your husband requested and executed on his behalf in 2019 under the durable power of attorney, the quarterly distribution to Marcus's account has been processed as follows. Below it was a table. Numbers I had no context for yet, but numbers that made my stomach drop anyway because the phrase durable power of attorney was doing something in my chest I didn't have words for. My grandfather was 78, sharp as anyone I'd ever met, still driving his own truck, still doing his own crossword and pen half the time. Why would he have a power of attorney in place, and why would my parents be the ones executing amendments to his trust on his behalf? I closed the laptop. I didn't print my referral form. I drove home with my hands too tight on the wheel, going 15 under the speed limit the whole way because I was terrified after everything of being in another accident, but more terrified of what I'd just seen. I didn't say anything to Grandpa Walter for 2 weeks. I turned it over and over trying to find an innocent explanation, the same way I'd spent 26 years finding innocent explanations for everything my parents did that hurt me. Maybe it was standard practice for aging parents to set up a power of attorney with their children as a precaution. Maybe my grandfather had asked for this himself quietly the way he did everything. But something about the phrase amendments you and your husband requested and executed on his behalf kept snagging in my mind like a nail catching fabric. Requested. Executed on his behalf. Not as instructed by him. Requested. I finally asked him directly on a Sunday afternoon in his garage, where he was refinishing an old rocking chair that had belonged to my grandmother, because Grandpa Walter always talked more easily with his hands busy. Do Mom and Dad have power of attorney over your finances? His hand stopped moving on the sandpaper. He didn't look at me right away. Why do you ask that, sweetheart? I told him what I'd seen. Not proudly, I admitted I hadn't meant to see it, that it had been an accident, a wrong click, but that once I'd seen it I couldn't unsee it, and I needed to know if he was okay, if something was happening to him that he hadn't told me. He set the sandpaper down very carefully on the workbench, the way you set something down when your hands aren't quite steady and you don't want anyone to notice. I signed something in 2019, he said slowly, after your grandmother passed. I wasn't in a good place, Claire. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating right, and your parents came to me and said it would be easier for everyone if they could help manage some of the trust paperwork, just the administrative side, filing and distributions, nothing major, they said. I trusted them. She was my daughter. Why wouldn't I trust her? And the amendments? I don't know what amendments you're talking about, he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, my grandfather looked frightened. That was the moment the mystery cracked open. And once it didn't close again. We didn't confront anyone that day. Grandpa Walter, despite his age, had spent 40 years running a construction business, which meant he had spent 40 years dealing with contracts, subcontractors who tried to cut corners, clients who tried to avoid paying, and he had exactly one piece of advice for how to handle a situation like this. You don't go in swinging, he told me, back in his kitchen with 2 mugs of black coffee between us. You go in with the paper trail already in your pocket. People like your mother, people who are careful, who smile a lot, who never raise their voice, they're not careless people, Claire. If something's wrong here, it's not going to be sloppy. We're going to have to be smarter than sloppy. So we started building the file. Not with anger, not yet, but with the same slow, methodical patience my grandfather had used his whole life to build houses that didn't fall down. The first thing he did was call Feldman and Cross directly and request a full copy of his own trust documents, which, as the grantor, he had every legal right to see regardless of any power of attorney in place. It took 11 days for the firm to respond, which he found strange, since normally a request like that should take 2 or 3. When the documents finally arrived in a thick manila envelope, he called me before he'd even finished reading them, and his voice on the phone was different than I'd ever heard it, quiet in a way that scared me more than shouting would have. Come over, was all he said. I drove to his house that evening and found the documents spread across his kitchen table, along with the accordion folder I'd first seen in the hospital, which I now understood he'd been quietly assembling for far longer than 18 months. He'd been keeping copies of bank statements, old emails he'd printed, letters from the estate attorney, receipts going back years. Not because he'd suspected anything specific, but because that was simply how Walter had lived his whole life. Everything documented, everything filed. An old habit from decades of contracts and inspections where a missing paper could cost you a lawsuit. The trust, originally, had been simple and generous in a way that broke my heart a little to read, because it reflected the grandfather I actually knew, not the confused, betrayed man sitting across from me now. In 2015, 4 years after my grandmother's cancer diagnosis and a year before her death, Walter had restructured his estate to split evenly upon his death, between his 2 grandchildren, myself and Marcus, with a smaller portion designated for a scholarship fund at the community college where my grandmother had taught night classes for 30 years. My parents were named as trustees, meaning they'd manage the assets until Marcus and I turned 35, at which point the trust would dissolve and disperse in full. That was the original document. Fair. Balanced. Exactly what I would have expected from him. The amended version, dated August 2019, 4 months after Grandpa Walter signed the power of attorney following my grandmother's death, told a very different story. The scholarship fund had been removed entirely. In its place, a new mechanism had been added: quarterly advance distributions to Marcus, structured as loans against his future inheritance but explicitly marked, in a clause buried on page 14, as non-repayable if Marcus reached the age of 35 while the trust was still active, which, given his current spending patterns, it clearly would be. In plain language, they weren't loans. They were gifts dressed up as loans so they wouldn't look like straightforward favoritism if anyone ever checked. And they had been checking regularly. Quarterly, going back to late 2019, sums ranging from $4,000 to $9,000, always timed suspiciously close to whatever crisis Marcus was currently having: the repossessed car, the apartment deposit, a business opportunity involving a food truck that lasted 5 months before folding. My share, meanwhile, had been quietly reduced. Not eliminated, that would have been too obvious, too easy to catch, but restructured so that a significant percentage of what would have been my portion was redirected into something called the Family Contingency Reserve, a fund that, according to the amended trust language, my parents controlled as trustees with sole discretion over disbursement, even after the trust technically dissolved. In other words, when Grandpa Walter passed away, Marcus would receive his full inheritance outright, having already received a steady stream of it for years under the fiction of loans. I would receive a reduced base amount, and the rest would sit in an account my parents controlled indefinitely, with no obligation, none, to ever give it to me at all. I sat at that kitchen table and read it twice, then a third time, because some part of my brain kept insisting there had to be another explanation, the same defense attorney instinct that had excused 4 months of silence, excused $200 offered like a favor, excused 11 minutes at a hospital bedside. But there was no other explanation on page 14. There was only the plain, quiet arithmetic of a family deciding, on paper, in language designed never to be questioned, that one grandchild mattered more than the other. "They did this 4 months after your grandmother died," Walter said. And his voice cracked on the word died in a way I had never heard from him before, not once, not even at the funeral. I was barely functioning. I trusted my own daughter to help me, and she used that trust to write my granddaughter out of her fair share while I was too broken to notice. I want to tell you that my next move was fury, that I drove straight to my parents' house and threw the folder on their dinner table and demanded an explanation. That's not what happened, and I think that's important to say because revenge stories on this channel sometimes make it look like the moment of discovery and the moment of confrontation happen back to back, a single dramatic beat. Real life isn't like that. Real life makes you sit with the truth for a long time before you're ready to do anything with it. I sat with it for 6 weeks. During that time, my grandfather, methodical as ever, quietly consulted an elder law attorney of his own, someone entirely unconnected to Feldman and Cross, a woman named Renata Ibarra who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, financial exploitation of the elderly by family members, which once she reviewed the documents she stated plainly and without hesitation was exactly what this was. Not a gray area. Not a family disagreement about money. Exploitation, using a power of attorney obtained during a period of documented grief and diminished capacity, to materially and knowingly restructure an estate for the benefit of the people holding that power. He was recently widowed, prescribed sedatives for insomnia at the time he signed the amendment, and there's a documented pattern of unequal distribution favoring the trustee's preferred child. Renata told us in her office, sliding a legal pad across the table with notes she'd made during our first consultation. This isn't just unethical. Depending on how we frame it, this could constitute financial elder abuse under state law. And that's before we even get into whether Marcus's distributions were properly disclosed to the IRS as gifts, which based on these numbers I doubt they were. That last detail turned out to matter more than any of us expected. Renata brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet, precise man named Oscar Fong, who spent 3 weeks going through 8 years of bank statements, trust records, and tax filings with the kind of patience that made me understand why my grandfather had liked him immediately. What Oscar found wasn't just favoritism. It was a paper trail of quiet theft dressed up in respectable language. The loans to Marcus had never been reported as gifts on any tax filing, despite exceeding the annual gift tax exclusion in 6 of the 8 years Oscar reviewed, meaning my parents, acting as trustees, had also potentially exposed the estate to real tax liability they'd simply chosen not to disclose, betting, probably correctly, that nobody would ever check closely enough to notice. The family contingency reserve, the fund meant to quietly swallow my share, had also been used twice, according to Oscar's reconstruction of the transactions, to cover expenses that had nothing to do with any family emergency at all. Once for a portion of the down payment on my parents' lake house. Once for $4,000 that flowed, through 2 intermediate transfers designed to obscure the trail, directly into my father's business account during a slow quarter for his firm. They hadn't just favored my brother. They had been quietly using my grandfather's trust, money meant for my grandmother's memory and my own future, as an interest-free personal slush fund, for years, while telling me things were tight whenever I asked for help. I remember the exact moment Oscar laid that last transfer out on the table, the $4,000 into my father's business account, traced through 2 shell transfers that existed for no reason except to make tracing it harder. I remember looking at my grandfather's face, at how still he went, at how he reached over without a word and put his hand flat on the table beside the printout, not touching it, just resting his hand there like he needed something solid to hold on to that wasn't a person who might also disappoint him. I built that lake house down payment with my own hands practically, he said quietly. I taught your father how to frame a wall the summer before you two got married. And he used my wife's memory to help pay for it. We didn't move to confront anyone yet. Renata was firm about that, and in hindsight I understand why. She wanted every piece of the evidence locked down first, documented, notarized where necessary, because she said family members caught doing something like this rarely respond with honesty. They respond with damage control, and damage control, if you let it start before you're ready, can make evidence disappear. So for another 2 months we gathered quietly. Grandpa Walter, still legally the grantor of his own trust despite the power of attorney, formally requested and received, through Renata, a complete accounting from Feldman and Cross of every transaction made under his name since 2019. The firm, to their credit, once they understood the scrutiny they were now under, cooperated fully, and even flagged 2 transactions their own compliance department had apparently questioned internally back in 2021 but never followed up on, a detail that would matter later. I kept working through my own recovery during those months, walking without the cane by month 7, back at the clinic part-time by month 8, and there was something strange and almost peaceful about carrying this enormous quiet secret through ordinary days, seeing my mother at a birthday dinner for Marcus's 30th and smiling and asking about her garden while knowing, with absolute documented certainty, exactly what she had done and exactly how much it had cost me. I didn't feel triumphant carrying that secret. I felt sad mostly. Grief has strange timing. Sometimes it arrives after the wound and sometimes I learned it arrives after the proof. Renata eventually determined we had 3 possible paths forward. We could pursue this criminally, given the elder financial abuse statute in our state, which could have resulted in real legal consequences for my parents, potentially even prosecution. We could pursue it civilly, suing to have the 2019 amendments voided and the original 2015 trust reinstated, which would restore the scholarship fund and my equal share, and would also allow us to claw back some of the misappropriated funds. Or we could handle it privately, using the documented evidence as leverage to force a quiet, negotiated correction, without ever involving courts or police at all. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who's ever been in a similar position. Part of me wanted the criminal path. Part of me, the part still lying in that hospital bed hearing 11 seconds of silence on the phone, wanted my parents to face real consequences, wanted a courtroom, wanted them to have to sit across from a judge the way I had sat alone in a recovery room while my mother had dinner with the Hendersons. But Grandpa Walter, when I told him what I was leaning toward, took my hand across his kitchen table and said something I've thought about almost every day since. Claire, I'm 78 years old. I don't have the years left to spend them in courtrooms and depositions, watching my daughter's name dragged through something ugly, even if she earned it. What I have left, I want to spend making sure the truth is on paper permanently, where nobody can rewrite it again, and making sure you get what should have always been yours. That's not weakness. That's choosing what actually matters. So we chose the quiet path. Not because my parents deserved quiet, because my grandfather did, and because I realized sitting with him that evening, that the version of justice I actually wanted wasn't a courtroom spectacle. It was simply the truth, undeniable, documented, finally spoken out loud in a room they couldn't argue their way out of. We set the meeting for a Sunday afternoon, at Grandpa Walter's house, the same kitchen table where the documents had first been spread out. He invited my parents over under the pretense of discussing some estate planning updates, which wasn't even a lie, just an incomplete truth, the same kind of incomplete truth they had built an entire scheme out of. I asked to be there. Renata came too, introduced simply as a family friend helping with paperwork, which made my mother's eyes flicker with the first note of suspicion I'd seen from her in years. My mother has always been sharp. I think some part of her knew, the moment she saw a stranger with a leather folder sitting at that kitchen table, that this Sunday afternoon was not going to be about paperwork updates. My father tried small talk for the first few minutes, something about the Hendersons, an unbearable irony that I don't think he even registered. My mother sat very still, her hands folded on the table in a posture I recognized from every family dinner of my childhood. The posture of a woman who had learned that stillness was its own kind of control. Grandpa Walter didn't raise his voice. He never does. He simply reached into the accordion folder, now thick with 18 months of accumulated evidence, and set the original 2015 trust document on the table, followed by the 2019 amendment, followed, one by Oscar's transaction summaries, the lake house down payment, the $4,000 routed into my father's business account, the 8 years of loans to Marcus that were never loans at all. "I'd like you to explain this to me," he said, sliding the papers across the table with the same steady patience he used to hand a client an inspection report. "Not to Claire. Not to Renata. To me. Explain to your father why you decided, for months after your mother died, while I could barely get out of bed in the morning, that this was the right time to rewrite my trust." I watched my mother's face during those next several minutes more closely than I've ever watched anything in my life. I watched the stillness crack, not into tears, not right away, but into something colder, calculating, the look of someone doing rapid math on how much could still be salvaged. "Dad, it wasn't like that," she started. "Marcus needed help, he was struggling, you know how hard things have been for him, and we thought, given everything with the business and the market, that it made sense to structure things a little differently. We always intended for Claire to. For $1,000 into your husband's business account," Grandpa Walter said quietly, tapping the page. "Explain that part to me. Was that struggling too?" My father, to his credit or perhaps just his cowardice, said nothing at all. He looked at the table. My mother's mouth opened and closed once, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother run out of words. "I trusted you with everything I had left of your mother," Grandpa Walter said, and his voice, for the only time that whole afternoon, wavered. "Not the money, Diane. I don't care about the money, not really. I built it with my hands and I can build more if I need to. That's never been the point. I trusted you with her memory. She wanted that scholarship fund. She talked about those night students for 30 years, Diane. You grew up hearing her talk about them, and you erased it from the page like it never mattered, so you could quietly move money toward your son and your husband's business. And you let your daughter believe for 18 months that this family was too poor to help her after a car accident that nearly killed her." The silence after that lasted longer than 11 seconds. I know, because this time I wasn't the only one counting it. Renata, calm and professional throughout, laid out the paths forward exactly as she'd explained them to me and my grandfather weeks earlier, but this time she made clear which path had already been chosen and why the choice was final. The original 2015 trust would be reinstated in full, restoring the scholarship fund in my grandmother's name and my equal share of the inheritance. The power of attorney would be revoked immediately and replaced, if my grandfather chose to have one at all, with an independent professional fiduciary, someone with no personal stake in the outcome. The misappropriated funds, the lake house contribution, the business account transfer, would be repaid to the trust, with a structured schedule Renata had already drafted, sitting quietly in her folder the entire time waiting. And if my parents refused any part of it, Renata said, without raising her voice any more than my grandfather had raised his, the documentation Oscar had compiled would be submitted to the state's Elder Abuse Division, along with amended filings to the IRS regarding the undisclosed gifts, which alone could trigger a significant tax liability investigation independent of anything else. There was no scene. No shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic exit. That's not how my family operates, even at the very end of something. My mother signed the documents Renata had prepared, her hand visibly unsteady in a way I had genuinely never seen from her before, not once in 26 years. My father signed after her, silent the entire time, and I understood, watching him, that his silence in that kitchen was the same silence he'd offered me from a hospital bed 18 months earlier, a man who had never once, in either moment, found the courage to actually say anything real. Marcus wasn't at that meeting. He found out 3 days later, when my mother finally called him, and according to what Grandpa Walter told me afterward, Marcus's first question wasn't about the scholarship fund or our grandmother's memory or even about me. His first question was whether this meant the quarterly deposits would stop. I won't pretend that didn't hurt hearing that, but by then I think I had already grieved the version of Marcus I'd hoped he might become, the same way I'd grieved the version of my parents I'd spent 26 years defending. I want to tell you what happened in the months after because I think the ending matters as much as the discovery, maybe more. His scholarship fund was reinstated within 6 weeks, and Grandpa Walter asked me to help him choose the first recipient, a detail he insisted on even though it wasn't technically necessary, because he said my grandmother would have wanted family hands involved in choosing who got the help she'd always believed in giving. We sat together at that same kitchen table, going through applications from night students at the community college, and I watched him read each essay carefully, the same steady patience he'd given every piece of evidence in that accordion folder. And I understood watching him that this was who he actually was underneath everything, a man who built things carefully and made sure they lasted. My relationship with my parents did not return to what it had been before, and I want to be honest that I don't consider that a loss. What it had been before was built on my willingness to explain away their absence, and once I stopped doing that, once the 11 seconds of silence became something I refused to defend anymore, there wasn't much left holding the relationship together except habit. We speak occasionally now. Holidays, mostly brief and careful, the kind of relationship where everyone is polite and nobody pretends the last 2 years didn't happen. My mother has never apologized in a way that felt like an actual apology rather than damage control. I've made my peace with that, mostly on the days when peace is available to me, and I've made room for the days when it isn't. What I gained instead was something I hadn't expected to gain at all, which was a much clearer, much closer relationship with my grandfather, in whatever years he has left. We still do crosswords together on Sunday afternoons. He still refuses to let me pay him back for the envelopes he left during those 4 months I couldn't work, no matter how many times I bring it up, though I've started quietly opening a savings account in his name instead, adding to it whenever I can, because I've learned that sometimes love has to be sneaky to get past someone's pride, and I learned that from him. I finished paying off my medical bills 8 months ago. I bought the small house I'd been saving for, the one my parents' silence had nearly cost me, using the restored inheritance as part of the down payment, and Grandpa Walter helped me pick out the porch railing, insisting on doing some of the work himself despite my protests about his age, because he said a man needs something to build with his hands or he starts forgetting who he is. I think about that hospital room sometimes, the 11 seconds of silence, the way I lay there believing, in that moment, that being unloved by your own parents was simply something you learned to live with quietly, the way you learn to live with a scar. I don't believe that anymore. I believe now that quiet isn't the same as acceptance, and that sometimes the people who show up for you really show up, aren't the ones bound to you by blood alone, but the ones who choose patiently, deliberately, folder by folder, page by page, to make sure the truth outlasts the silence. My grandfather likes to say that a house built on a bad foundation will always show the cracks eventually, no matter how nice the paint looks on the surface. I used to think he was only talking about houses. I understand now he was talking about all of it, the whole time, patiently waiting for me to be ready to hear it. If you've ever been the child in your family who got the silence instead of the phone call, the $200 instead of the drive to the hospital, I want you to know that the silence isn't proof you weren't worth showing up for. Sometimes it just takes longer to find the person who will. Mine took 78 years and an accordion folder held together with a rubber band, and it was worth every quiet, patient minute of the wait.